coming this morning, and I want to thank as well two people who are going to sort of initiate us in conversation this morning. One of the things that I came to learn personally later in my life in Holy Cross, but I knew intuitively when I joined, is that Congregation of Holy Cross has an international dimension to it, and a very important one. And one of the reasons Holy Cross was attractive to me is because when I was discerning priesthood, I wasn't sure whether I was interested in traditional parish work primarily, or I came to know them through higher education here. But since I was a child, I always had a sense of desire to be a missionary as well. And it wasn't until I'd been ordained about 9 years, or 6 years, that I realized just how vital and vibrant we are across the globe. In some ways, some of our most inspiring, heart-thumping work happens in other places. Maybe you see it as an outsider. People come here and they're inspired by it as well. So this morning, we have the religious superior, Father Jim King, who's no stranger to us in student affairs. He's also long served in student affairs, particularly as the rector of Soren Hall. We have Terry Fitzgibbons as well, who is one of our newest rectors, rector of Duncan Hall, who is not only a Notre Dame undergraduate, but has worked with Holy Cross internationally as well. So I want to thank them for coming this morning, and we just ask that the Lord would bless you and to bless us, that as you open up your lives and your experience and your vocations, that we too may enter into that space, and that space may be holy and sacred. And we ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen. So, Jim, are you going to start us off?
Yes.
Great, thanks. Jim, Terry, thank you.
Occasionally, I wish I were a missionary too, like on some football weekends. I've got to say that after 20 years of living in residence halls, I still haven't adjusted to the hours of that people like you keep, and I can't quite understand how you manage to function at this time of the day. So that's going to explain any incoherence on my part. Now, include Terry in that too, since he's got it even worse as he's still doing this crazy life of rectoring. I'm also aware that that about a month ago you had Father Drew Garbage here to talk to you about Holy Cross. And as Drew talks about as fast as a hummingbird flaps its wings, I can imagine he probably packed in about 3 hours of what Holy Cross is about in those 50 minutes that he talked to you. So I was left thinking, what did Drew not cover? And I can't imagine that he didn't cover very much, because I heard that talk from him just a couple of months ago. So, and the other thing is that I was asked to talk about the structures of Holy Cross, and I can't think of anything duller than that. And I'm not sure that I could cover how complicated we are in 15 hours, so I'm going to try to get through this in 15 minutes, and then get to the more interesting part of Terry Fitzgibbons' experiences of living with Holy Cross in East Africa. This picture here is kind of a famous one. It was taken on the front steps of the administration building probably in the early to mid 1870s of the community at that time. I think there's about 21, 22 people in that picture. By 1900, Holy Cross had gotten to the point where there were 700 priests and brothers worldwide. 100 years later, we were about twice that many. People talk about vocation shortage in the church since the 60s and 70s, and our numbers have gone down since then. But anybody familiar with our early history would have doubted that we would have grown to the point that we did in 2000. And I think most people who were aware of our humble beginnings in a region known as Saint Croix, a suburb of Le Mans, might have doubted that we would make it to 1900. So by the time 2100 rolls around, who knows what's going to happen? We've experienced a lot of twists and turns in our history, and it's hard to know what's going to happen 100 years in advance, but I'm pretty optimistic about our future and our capacity for growing in different parts of the globe and hopefully here too. We were well, to be frank, we were a motley collection of people from the start. We began in France. Actually, the genesis of Holy Cross was the work of a priest known as Father Jacques Dujarier, who founded a group of teaching brothers to go out into the countryside and the towns of that area to try to recatechize the people of France in the aftermath of the French Revolution. As his health began to fail, he looked for a young priest to take that over. He settled on Father Moreau. And a couple of years after Father Moreau took that task upon himself in 1837, he also recognized the need for a group of what he termed auxiliary priests to go and to preach missions and retreats to the same group of people. So he welded these two entities that really had nothing in common with one another into a single group. And it's hard to know exactly why he did. It's conceivable that he did so for his own convenience and making it easier to administer these two groups, but we think that he saw something more. And the something more that he had distantly in his mind was a religious community modeled on the example of the Holy Family, of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. The other thing that is important here in our early history is that Father Moreau wanted official recognition from Rome, from the Vatican, for his religious community. Now, why would he want that? Well, if I can make an analogy, doctors, lawyers, psychologists, other professionals need to be licensed, or there isn't a whole lot that you can do. Similarly, in the church, there isn't a whole lot of ministry that priests and brothers can do if they are not officially recognized. And at this early point in our history, we were just a small group under the authority of a diocesan bishop, the Bishop of Le Mans in France, whom Father Moreau did not get along with very well at all. And he had bigger ideas. Rome figures importantly because with that always in the back of his mind, that desire for official approval, Father Moreau took some steps early on to put Holy Cross on the map. 3 years after the priests and brothers were brought together, Father Moreau accepted a mission to Algeria, which was under French control. That might not have seemed like too big a step, but it certainly was a move from catechizing and teaching people in the French countryside to cross the Mediterranean and minister to Algerians. Then the following year, he accepted a mission to the United States. And Father Sorin and a group of brothers settled in the wilderness of northern Indiana. So at that point, we were in a French colony, we were in America, and 12 years later, he accepted a mission to Bengal, now Bangladesh, that nobody wanted. And in fact, the first couple waves of Holy Cross people died within months of getting off the boat and needed to be replenished again and again. That was a critical factor in Rome granting us the official recognition that we received in 1857. So almost from the outset, we've been teachers, we've been people who have gone out to parishes, and as Father Tom said, we've been missionaries. Our structure, which I've been asked to talk about briefly, looks relatively clean and simple when you do it in the form of an organizational chart. Father Warner, whom most of you know from his time as Director of Campus Ministry here, was elected Superior General last year. And our headquarters is in Rome. And as Superior General, he has responsibility for all of Holy Cross, all priests and brothers worldwide. And there are about 1,300 of us. We are, in fact, a smallish to medium-sized religious order. Sometimes, because of our association with Notre Dame, people might think we're like the Jesuits or the Franciscans, but they have 10 to 15 times as many people as we do. We're really pretty small by comparison. We are divided in the 16 countries that we serve into 16 provinces and vicariates, which are not necessarily contiguous with national boundaries. A province is essentially a self-governing entity, one that has sufficient vocations and can function independently, as the financial resources to do so. A vicariate is very similar, but it's essentially an entity that used to be a province but has declined. For example, our numbers are very small in France or in English Canada. So the name is a little bit different. Functionally, though, they're pretty much the same. So Father Warner has responsibility and works through those 16 people across the world. Our provincial superior, Father Tyson, whom many of you also know, is headquartered here. Our province, since a merger with what used to be known as the Eastern Province of the United States earlier this year, now comprises over 400 people, or about a third of the entire congregation. That includes all of us priests here in the United States. It also includes 3 mission districts, a district being a growing entity that is sponsored by a larger province. So we have districts in Peru, in Chile, and in East Africa especially, which is getting to the point where it will become a province in the not too distant future. A lot of vocations, a lot of growth. And then there's the more lowly level that I occupy as local superior here at Notre Dame. Priests and brothers live together in community, in houses. Unless you're a parish priest and there's only 2 of you, you tend to live in a larger group. Those groups may range in size from 7 or 8 to the almost 60 people that we have here at Notre Dame, which comprises the largest individual religious house in the congregation, just a little under 5% of our membership. So there's a visual which shows you where we are, although I think I've only got the bottom half of Notre Dame there, and my cropping may have cut out Stonehill College as well, but I think Portland's there in the upper left. But you can see that this is a rather large group to administer. When you think about trying to oversee not only schools and parishes and other works in the U.S., but in Chile and Peru and 3 countries in East Africa as well. It's a pretty big job. And it got bigger a few months ago when our province, which used to be known as the Indiana province, merged with the East. That's rather important because some of you have probably heard that we're going to have what's called a provincial chapter next year. Now, all religious communities do this. All organizational entities have to organize themselves in some fashion, and we call it a chapter, but it's basically a legislative assembly that we have every 3 years with people who are there ex officio because they're the provincial or members of his administration or district superiors. But most of the people who will go to that chapter out in Portland next year will be elected from the membership, and there'll be 60 people total. It's particularly important, too, because we're going to be electing a new provincial. After 9 years, Father Tyson's tenure in that job is up. Someone else will be elected by those chapter delegates, which means that not only will he change jobs, but he'll appoint assistants who will also change jobs. So there's going to be a number of people on July 1st who are going to have different jobs than they thought they were going to have on June 1st, which may set a whole bunch of dominoes in mind and make some people disconcerted both in the community and out of the community. It's not unusual for people in a parish to discover around July 1st that their pastor that they thought would be with them for a few more years has been pulled into provincial administration. So we're all going to be a little bit nervous come next summer, and you may detect some looks of anxiety on our faces, not knowing where we're going to be. So that's how we're structured. It's the 10 to 15 minute version of how we're structured anyway. It sounds relatively simple, but in fact, in the interest of honesty, it's much more complicated. We have these entities called vicariates, which are declining in size, but structurally are at a higher level than districts that are much bigger. We have provinces. One of the criteria is that they be financially independent, and we have some such in Bangladesh that aren't and may never be in the foreseeable future. Our province is 1/3 of the membership worldwide, but when we get together in these big meetings, a general chapter is basically a worldwide version of a provincial chapter. With everybody else that has to be included, we tend not to be represented very well. And another anomaly that many of you have undoubtedly noticed is that there's this group of brothers that are across the road in Holy Cross College, and they're an entirely separate province from us, because the priests and the brothers split into provinces in 1945, although some of the brothers didn't want to go with the brothers' province and they stayed with the priest province. Now you know why you're getting the 15-minute version. I could go on for 15 hours and you still wouldn't understand how we're structured. Like I said, we're kind of a motley collection. I'm reminded of a movie line. Can't remember the name of the movie, but the family has a brawl in the front yard, and one of the servants walks away muttering, "Messy family, messy family." Well, in practice, I think we are too, and if we're honest, most of our families are kind of messy, so if you've noticed that in us, I can't blame you. But there are some things that I think are common or enduring characteristics. We do continue to be a missionary community. And we always have to remember that this place began as a mission. And I think we will go out of existence when we stop being a missionary community and stop finding new opportunities and new places to go to. And wherever we go, we continue to prioritize education, whether it's at the level of parish or high school or college or university. That's our niche. We try to be responsive to the needs of the church. The way that we began in accepting missions to Algeria and then the United States and then Bengal and all sorts of other places has been somewhat random. And I think an honest critic of Holy Cross would say that we have often stretched ourselves too thin. Father Soren did from the beginning. We've closed parishes and schools recently, but Father Soren closed more schools than remained by the end of his lifetime. He was not above experimenting. He was not above giving something a try, even if the prospects for success were not very great. And indeed, the University of Notre Dame was one of those that could have failed very easily. So some might criticize us for that as well, for taking on commitments that we can't sustain, but we're not risk-averse people. And I think if you're going to be a missionary community, you can't really afford to be that risk-averse and that afraid to fail. But wherever we go as educators in the faith, I hope that we try to promote a family-like atmosphere, because I think that's one of our characteristics as well. It accounts a lot for the atmosphere of religious life, of residence life that people experience here. It accounts for the easy way that I think people who have us as priests in their parishes, how they relate to us. I think it's characteristic of our own internal life as well. We're not the Benedictines, we're not a group of monks, we're not very formal with one another or with other people, but that really is an enduring characteristic from Father Moreau, who based his hopes for the congregation upon that model of the Holy Family. So with that, I'm going to allow you to get to the more interesting part of this presentation and have Terry come up here and talk to you about how he experienced that himself in a place that may sound far away, although we've had an increasing number of students going to Uganda lately. But I think, I hope, because I haven't checked with him, that that Terry will confirm that his experience of Holy Cross in Uganda shared many characteristics with his experience of Holy Cross here at Notre Dame, and hopefully how you've experienced us here as well. So, Terry.
Is this okay? Okay. Thank you. All right, well, thank you, Father Jim, and good morning. It's good to be with you. Either due to coincidence or providence, I landed in Uganda in 2009 as an overseas lay mission, OLM, volunteer with the Congregation of Holy Cross. I went because I wanted to do some good, but I also went out of pride, thinking that I could only do good with the poorest of the poor. And the poorest of the poor are, statistically speaking, in sub-Saharan Africa. And if I wasn't with the poorest of the poor, then I would feel like I wasn't doing enough, or it would appear to others that I wasn't doing enough. So for some good and also for some less than altruistic reasons, I landed in Uganda. My primary ministries were teaching 5th grade English and 6th grade math at St. Jude Holy Cross Primary School in the village of Buwekula. And I also taught Introduction to Islam and Interfaith Dialogue electives at the Philosophy Center, Jinja, an undergraduate consortium where Holy Cross sends its candidates. I like to think that my 5th graders improved their reading comprehension. I like to think that my 6th graders finally understand the conversion of fractions to decimals. And I like to think that the Holy Cross and Carmelite and Comboni missionary candidates that I taught in my class have a deeper appreciation for the Quran and for their Muslim brothers and sisters. I think we made a difference as OLMs, but this is not the story of white American male goes to Uganda and teaches and enlightens the continent. As we often hear from these international exchange and service experiences, I gained more than I gave. It is a trite summation that people give, but a true one. I did gain more than I gave. Is that fair? I went to a much poorer country, gained experience, got to travel, put it on my resume, made some great friends, and got to feel good about myself, especially as people here pat me on the back and thank me for going over there. That $1,500 plane ticket, I know, could have gone to Oxfam or Catholic Relief Services to buy food or pay for someone's school fees. I perhaps took away a teaching job at St. Jude's that could have gone to a Ugandan in a country that suffers from great unemployment. So is that fair that I gained more than I gave? And that's a question I'll return to. I have many heartbreaking and heartwarming images and stories from Uganda. There is Jarvis, who came to our door during our 2nd week in Uganda. 2 days after he was diagnosed HIV positive, after his roommate kicked him out because he was HIV positive. Jarvis, 24, from Rwanda, cried on our front porch and told us his story, which included, among other things, 15 years prior, watching his father and siblings be murdered in front of him in the Rwandan genocide. Jarvis now works as a Mason and educates people in his diocese on HIV/AIDS. There is Hayat Namugemba, a third grader at St. Jude's, and her family who invited us to her home for Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha, the two holiest Muslim feast days. They had nothing, materially speaking, but they lavished us with food. There were the men we visited in prison on Sundays with the Holy Cross candidates in their apostolates, some of them in there for months without being charged, and some of them with open, oozing sores and horrid conditions. There is Caesar and Gloria, brother and sister, age 10 and 6, who lived at the El Shaddai orphanage. When he was 5, at his mother's instruction in the war-torn north, Caesar would keep watch through the night in the bush for his nursing mother and sister in case of the ravishing Lord's Resistance Army rebel group showing up. And there are these recent letters from Uganda by way of my hall president who did a ISSLP there this past summer. A couple selections. This one from Priska. Dear Terry, and she goes on and on about how she does no multiplication these days. But then she mentions, I am not happy because I lost my cousin's sister who was going to be helping me in my school fees. My parents are poor. They cannot afford to complete school fees in time. Tell your friends that I love them with all my soul and heart. And then she goes on and talks more about multiplication. This one is from Joseph Wambuzi, who's kind of a mini celebrity among the Ugandan Notre Dame crowd. Dear Mr. Terry, how are you these days? To this side, am okay. I still have hope at least one day like this to visit University of Notre Dame. Am I known there at our university? When I come in America and I have nowhere to stay, I do have hope to stay at Notre Dame University. And then he goes on to talk about multiplication. And then he said, please greet all Notre Dame students, and I thank them. So life in Uganda is hard. Not necessarily for us lay volunteers. I mean, it was more difficult in some ways. We would go days without electricity. We had to boil our water. We lived under, we had to sleep under mosquito nets. We rarely ate meat, for example. But we always knew the electricity would be back. And if not, we could go across the street to the Holy Cross Formation House and use their generator and their internet. If water was scarce, we could always go across the street. And while we didn't eat meat, we certainly didn't go hungry. If we got sick, we had money for treatment. And if we got really sick, we knew Holy Cross would fly us back home to an American hospital. So I like to think we lived in solidarity as much as we could. That was something on which my housemates and we challenged each other continually. Life, though, wasn't that hard for us in Uganda. But life in Uganda is hard for Ugandans. Now, my Ugandan friends would be very upset with me if you got the impression, as we often get from the BBC, that Africa is solely poverty and misery. That is certainly not true. As the continent abounds with so many resources and blessings and hope and joy. But my Ugandan friends will have to forgive me because I did want to focus this talk on the poverty. And that's because when I reflected on the very general title of this particular talk given to Father Jim and me, what is Holy Cross? I thought Holy Cross is with the poor. And necessarily by being with the poor, Holy Cross is for the poor. Holy Cross is with the poor and for the poor in East Africa. Holy Cross is with and for the poor in West Africa. Holy Cross is with and for the poor in India and Bangladesh. Holy Cross is with and for the poor in Mexico, Chile, and Peru. Holy Cross is with and for the poor at Andre House in Phoenix, Arizona, and at the Downtown Chapel in Portland, Oregon, and in many of its parishes across the United States. In perhaps a more indirect way, Holy Cross is with and for the poor at its universities, including this university, through its research, its institutes, its centers, and most importantly, through its students and student initiatives. I believe Holy Cross must be with and for the poor. And if we spend time with the poor, we will necessarily become their advocates. An aside, I know there are many ways to be poor. I understand that most of our students here at Notre Dame are not from families below the poverty line. I was not when I came here. However, we in this division know our students are no less important than sub-Saharan African children. Their needs are no less dire. But for the sake of this particular talk, in light of Uganda, I did want to focus on the economically poor and oppressed. Because that question arises for me and for us. Is it fair that in these service experiences that we gain more than we give? And I thought, especially on my way home to the States, that in order to make it fairer, to at least partially pay back what we have been given, we would need to advocate on behalf of the poor and oppressed in places like Uganda. We need to speak and act out for peace and against increasing militarization, because, as Martin King said, war is an enemy of the poor. And because we know poverty isn't a naturally occurring phenomenon, and the third world didn't just happen, it was created. Therefore, we need to agitate the powerful and educate the maybe one day powerful on behalf of people like Jarvis or Caesar or Prisca. Holy Cross is with the poor in East Africa, and thus is for the poor in East Africa. And unfortunately, my return home from Uganda happened to coincide with this rejuvenated, viral, ruthless onslaught against the poor and working people here in the United States, whether that's through propaganda, caricature, or policy. Holy Cross is with and thus for the poor in the United States. We must continue to be so. The University of Notre Dame must continue to be so. The church must continue to be so. We cannot afford to be neutral or indifferent when it comes to the poor in East Africa or the poor in the United States. Our students are excellent in service. We do more service hours and have more service projects than a lot of other institutions. Service is in our blood, and I think that's excellent. It's part of what drew me here as a student in 2000 and now back as staff. Service is the rent we pay for a living. Marion Wright Edelman. Yes, it is. Service is the rent we pay for a living. But, I would add, justice is what love looks like in public. Cornel West. We are moving from just paying the rent to giving and sharing love. That is, we are moving from service to justice, or we are coupling service with justice. And in doing so, we in the Holy Cross family at Notre Dame, and at Notre Dame specifically ask, are we using our bountiful resources for good? Or are our resources a distraction? Does our research ultimately work for the poor? Do our investments work for or against the poor? Do our partners and alliances work for or against the poor? And most importantly, do our graduates work for or against the poor, knowingly or unknowingly? And at this critical juncture in the global landscape, when the poor are being slammed in the US, or worse, forgotten in Uganda, are we standing up? Are we acting out? What is Holy Cross? Holy Cross is with and for the poor. My favorite writer, the legendary Kurt Vonnegut, once said his goal was to catch people before they become generals and senators and presidents and poison their minds with humanity. For those of us who don't work or live directly with the poor per se, that's what we must do with the students whose paths cross ours at Notre Dame. We must poison their minds with humanity. It is a mutual exchange. We must allow them to poison our minds with humanity as well. We must introduce them to the poor of South Bend and of East Africa. And taking it a step further, we must poison their minds with divinity as well, to the degree we are capable. And it is Christ on the cross where humanity and divinity meet. The poor, the oppressed, the Roman occupied, the dissident, the executed Christ. We must stay close to that cross. In Uganda, at Notre Dame, and everywhere in between. Spes Unica. That is our only hope. Thank you.